Hello, welcome to part 2 of a web series called Leveraging Technology to Gain Equity Through Practice. Today's webinar is all about brain balance. My name is Amanda Arcio. I'm a digital ambassador with Nevada Digital Learning Collaborative, and my email address is aarceo.nvdlc@gmail.com. Reminders, so I'm recording this now. It will be eventually available on YouTube. The webinar that will be available on YouTube is closed caption webinar, so it will have accessibility available to it. If for whatever reason you have difficulty, please, again, don't hesitate to reach out to me at arceo.nvdlc@gmail.com. I'm happy to get you guys any of the resources found in here that we'll talk about, or even have a conversation with you about whatever you're hearing in this webinar today. So there's a picture of me that was taken at the Valley of Fire. I think that was about 3 years ago. Again, like I said, I'm a digital ambassador with Nevada Digital Learning Collaborative, but I'm also a learning coordinator with Nye County School District. I've been here in Nevada about 5 years, and of all the states I've ever lived in, it's my favorite. So I'm very excited to be able to help Nevada's educators and continue building that network within the state with all of the educators. I want to point out to you, there's a QR code in the top right there, plus a tiny URL. They both lead to the exact same place. I know some people aren't comfortable using QR codes. If you are comfortable, I'm going to leave this on the screen for a few seconds. Please whip out your cell phone. If you turn on the camera and then you point your camera towards the QR code, it'll pop up with a link. If you click on that link, it will take you to our, let me show you what it looks like, to our resource for our participants today. So it's a blue sheet and it's got a bunch of links on it that I'm going to be referencing throughout the webinar today. You can click on any of those. My email address is also on that. So again, if you pull out your phone camera and then point it at that, or you can go right here to the https://tinyurl.com/2xmvk p v as in Victor n. So I'll give you about 10 more seconds on the screen so you can take a shot of that with your camera. All right. So when I was doing the live version of this, I always ask my participants something to get them thinking about something that makes them happy. So I was going to ask what song, movie, or meal always makes you feel good. I urge you, and though you're watching this via YouTube, most likely that you think about something that makes you feel good. We all know this has been a very, very difficult couple of years. I don't think we've quite realized the extent of the trauma that we're all kind of sharing right now. So if you could just take a moment and think about something that makes you happy. I put some examples there of things that I enjoy. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about this webinar series, what the whole objective is over the course of 5 webinars. We're going to talk about what trauma is. We're going to discuss the brain and specifically parts and functions that have to do with memory and learning. We're then going to talk about the impact of trauma on memory and learning, and then give you a trauma-informed teacher toolkit to help you in your classroom as you're trying to create a safe space for your students to learn and to learn how to regulate their behaviors and emotions. So as I said, this is our second webinar. Our first one was identifying opportunity. That one we had on September 22nd. Some of the tools that I identify there, I'm also going to bring up here in today's webinar. So a lot of the tools that exist have multiple purposes and multiple uses. Today's brain balance. Coming up in January, we have PSYOP strategies. So we're looking at our EL kids, but those are strategies that impact all of our learners. We're going to talk about the depth and complexity icons in March. And then in May, we're going to talk about building community with digital learning tools. So trauma, what exactly is trauma? It's an emotional response to a terrible event. There are many symptoms that can result from trauma, things like shock, denial, unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, ultimately long-term impacts like strained relationships, physical symptoms can result. So trauma is the combination of the terrible event and the subsequent responses that your body has to those events, your body and your mind. There are different types of trauma. Um, there's acute, chronic, and complex. These are categorized across the board by many psychologists. Acute is a single incident, so one traumatic event happening one moment in time. Chronic is repeated and prolonged, so things like being exposed to domestic abuse, that would be a chronic form of trauma. And then there's complex, which is varied and multiple traumatic events across time. So um, having multiple single incidents, having single incidents combined with some chronic incidents, that's your complex trauma. The reality that we're facing right now in the pandemic, when we look at, we'll talk about healthcare workers and educators. We've got helplessness, repeated exposure, by patients if you're a healthcare worker, by students and other educators if you're in a school building. Educators are also facing continual disruption. So, for example, one of the things we're dealing with this year is because we're back, this is our particular county, right? Because we're back in person full time. I've got teachers telling me, there's 4 kids out last week, there's 9 kids out this week. So it's this never ending cycle of students that are in on quarantine. So they're back home and the teachers are trying to keep the ones at home up to date while the ones in class are also getting, his or her full attention. So it's difficult just to get your job done, right? The students themselves have a lack of security due to disruption in the routine and access to trustworthy adults and safe spaces. This was something that was a big concern right at the beginning when we had rapid shutdown because we did not have in-person options for our kiddos. And so we don't really know what's happening in each of the homes, and we don't know if the students rely on us to be their safe place during the day. And so having that lack of security just in safe space is a problem for some of our students, but for all of our students, the disruption in their routine was really problematic, right? And then you add to it the element of, students lacking security through watching adults be confident in what they do. And then all of a sudden, all the adults in their world are just kind of, in the same boat they're in, and we don't really know what's going on. That kind of shakes up their world, their little minds. All of us are experiencing grief, anxiety, isolation. Some of us are experiencing chronic trauma and even complex trauma if we've suffered the loss of a loved one. Some of us may be facing financial security due to early job issues or even continual job issues as we continue through this pandemic. So it's important to keep in mind that we are currently experiencing a shared trauma. And then trauma that our students can face that isn't related to COVID. So these are called adverse childhood experiences, some of what I'm talking about here, but a loss of a caretaker or loved one due to incarceration, forced removal, death, etc. If there's substance abuse in the home, domestic abuse within the home, divorce and mental illness in family have been 2 things that have been discussed much more often lately in the literature and the research, because they all have these adverse childhood experiences, all have impacts on our students. And then when we're thinking about a specific subset of our students, so in particular the students who are learning English, there may be other stresses and traumas that they're facing. So for example, there might be immigration stress or acculturative stress, racism, xenophobia, anti-immigrant or immigration sentiment within their communities. The language barrier itself can produce fear and uncertainty, especially as we're talking about peer interactions. There might be financial struggles, cultural differences for sure. And then there are possibly access issues to, so the parents may, whether due to their language or if they are new immigrants to the country or what have you, may have problems gaining access to mental health services, community resources, etc. So regardless of the type of trauma that it is, how it's categorized, um, where its origin is, it's having an impact on us and on our students. So when we talk about specifically, education, academia and learning, and the human brain, there are three main areas that are impacted by trauma. And those are located here in the blue color. We have the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive function decision maker. That's what it's taking responsibility for. The amygdala, which is our security guard. The hippocampus, which is our memory keeper, and it is highly sensitive to stress. It also helps us determine what is going to be short-term, working, or long-term memory. So that's the hippocampus. And then the other parts of the brain here, the cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. So before we jump into the brain as a whole, I hope at this point you know or have heard that the brain is made of neurons. Those are the special cells that our brain is made of. And instead of being round like a lot of the other cells in our body, the somatic cells in our body, or even flat and like a polygon, like our skin cells, neurons are shaped kind of like an arm. Like if you stick your arm out, like the simple neuron model found on the bottom here, and your hand and your fingers can count as the dendrites, your palm is the cell body, and then your arm itself is the axon. That is pretty much what a neuron looks like and how it's shaped. So if you are talking to your students about what makes up the brain, and if you're going to talk to them about what parts of the brain are impacted by trauma and how that's going to impact their learning, and you want to start with discussing neurons, this is a great way to get them to stand up, or even just sitting down. They can do this, stick their arm out and have them identify the different parts. For younger kids, this is going to be, you're not going to get too complex with it, but basically let them know that neuron is like a highway, right? And trauma acts as an obstacle in the highway. So imagine you're cruising down the highway and then all of a sudden there's like a brick wall in the middle of that highway, right? That is essentially how trauma impacts our brain. So the neuron, the reason they're shaped the way they are is because they are intended to send electrical impulses through our brain. And so the longer, thinner shape of it really helps those messages get further in a shorter amount of time. So imagine you're trying to send that electrical impulse or that message and something's blocking it. It's not going to get to where it needs to go. That's the impact that trauma has on the neurons in certain parts of our brain. So executive function is the prefrontal cortex, right? The prefrontal cortex helps us regulate thoughts, emotions, actions, and makes decisions based on input. The seat of emotion is the amygdala. The amygdala reacts to fear, danger, threat. It helps us to regulate our emotional state, and it codes emotional messages for long-term storage. So research shows that the amygdala, the size of the amygdala may have some impact on how people regulate emotions. But we're also going to talk about how trauma impacts the amygdala shortly. So the amygdala itself, when it is competent, so it is not being harmed by trauma, it's not being triggered, by trauma, helps us with imagination, with long-term planning, with self-development, introspection, reflection, ethical choices, making those ethical choices, managing our emotions, creativity and change, speaking and writing, reasoning, abstracting, problem solving. These are all things that the amygdala has an impact on when it is not impacted by trauma. However, when it is triggered by a traumatic situation, by a stressful situation, when something in the environment is telling the amygdala it is not safe, this is what begins to set off the fight, flight, or freeze reaction in our brains. So stress in the brain. The amygdala is the security guard. If you look here at this image, it talks to you about all the different steps of what's going on when it's setting off the alert to the hippocampus. So the first step is we have sensory data sent to the thalamus. So the environment that the student is in, right? The actual physical environment, the people that are in that environment, all of the nuanced information that's coming into the brain from that environment is sent to the thalamus, and the data is then sent to the amygdala. The amygdala is also sending data to the cortex, but while it's doing all of this, it's assessing whether the situation is safe or not. Once it does that quick threat assessment, if it feels like it is not safe, it will slow down the thinking, and it'll eventually send an alert to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is then what sets our brain into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And I'm promising you, when that fight, flight, or freeze mode is enacted, the learning that you are hoping your students are going to be achieving is not going to be happening at that moment. So the hippocampus is kind of shaped like a seahorse. It's the memory keeper. It helps to form, organize, and store memories, and it connects memories to other memories. So this is where some like long-term stuff is happening. There's a lot of detail of what goes into the process, but basically the hippocampus is receiving alerts from the amygdala. It's also taking in sensory information. If it's deeming it important or is somehow emotional, then it's going to communicate with the prefrontal cortex and the neocortex for higher order thinking, and therefore will code it in some long-term memory, and it'll along with the audio, the visual, the kinesthetic, it will create permanent memory. If it's determined irrelevant, not new, something that is not repeated, so something that they haven't had enough exposure to for their brain to think is important, it will go into short-term memory, but then eventually be deleted before it becomes this permanent memory. If it's considered unimportant from the very beginning, it doesn't even go through all of those processes, right? We don't even register it. And so we need to, looking at this flow diagram here, this flow chart, it is important to either share with our students the relevance of what they're learning or to somehow have some sort of emotional attachment to it. So when we think about best strategies in the classroom, obviously relevance is up there, right? Building and establishing that relevance, connecting it to previous learning, connecting it to something in the future that they're going to want to learn, but also having that that emotion, that joy may be connected with it, some fun. Having those types of feelings associated with the learning helps. It really does wonders with creating memory and then translating those memories into long-term memories. So if you think about it, the more stress, the less memory. So basically, no matter what you're putting in, long term, you're not holding on to as much. You've got roadblocks in those neurons. You've got your amygdala sending trigger alerts to the hypothalamus, which is telling us that it's fight, flight, or freeze. It is a survival situation. That is not a situation that your student is then going to have their learning brain on and be receptive to what you're trying to teach them. So the more stress that's happening, the less memory, the less learning, right? So we really do need to take an active step in creating kind of that safe space for our students and creating a what I call a brain-friendly classroom. So in summary, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex play pivotal roles in memory creation, storage, and recall. The amygdala determines the context of the learning. Is this neutral? or is it associated with an emotion like fear? Any trauma that happens or adverse childhood experience can lead to hyperactive amygdala response. And basically what that means is the amygdala is constantly seeking any little threat, and it will set it off, even in situations that, you and I may recognize as not truly being a threat. That doesn't mean your student's brain isn't perceiving it as a threat. So we need to be aware of that. The hippocampus is responsible for turning the short-term memories into long-term memories, and recall of memory is also, the hippocampus plays a role in that. And lots of research is showing that trauma physically impacts the hippocampus, which causes a misfiring. So that retention of memory, the encoding from short-term to long-term is just sometimes problematic once the student has experienced trauma and that part of the brain has been physically impacted. And then the prefrontal cortex enhances the encoding and extracting commonalities and differences in your memories, experiences, learned material. This is where that not only the encoding is like formally happening, but the extracting commonalities and differences, the recall, right? Why are these memories relevant? Later on, when you're trying to recall the memories, you think about the relevance and you pull those memories up. This is all important, but they're finding that trauma leads to hypoactive prefrontal cortex. So the encoding is not happening as much in students that have experienced trauma, and the extracting commonalities isn't happening as much because of the hypoactivity. So while this particular jar is not a digital learning tool, there are, if you Google digital, I think it's digital glitter jars, there are some different videos available where students can see these types of jars being shaken up and then watch them settle. You can also make a model with your students, like an actual model like this. Give them a jar, give them some glitter of varying textures, and put some sand in there, some metallic mini confetti, and then you can demonstrate the way the amygdala on high alert scatters information. So you do that by shaking the bottle to mix the solution, and then you'll watch that as time goes by, the solution kind of settles, with certain particulates settling quicker than others. Plus, it's actually quite calming for the students to see. So you get two things. You get to represent stress in the mind, but you also get to create this calming experience for them. So I've broken down the elements of a brain-friendly digital classroom into 4. So the number 1 is a safe and comfortable online classroom for all students. Number 2 is students have been taught the impact of trauma and stress on their learning brain. Number 3 is an extension of that. They've been taught emotional self-regulation and are given time and space to exercise it. And number 4, there are strategies in practice that allow the students to participate at their own comfort level. And by this, I particularly mean academic interactions, so engagement academically, that the teacher is aware of who her students are, what their needs are, and that there are strategies in practice that encourage participation while minimizing the stress and anxiety associated with that. So here is our trauma-informed teacher toolkit, digital version. Here's a table of contents. So these are slide numbers. On page 30, we have safe and comfortable online classroom checklist. So I've created a checklist for you to look at when you're thinking about how to create a safe and comfortable online space for your students. The next slide is a trauma education resources for students of various ages. So when you start to talk to them about their brain and the impact of trauma on their brain, there's a couple of different resources there. The next slide is a self-regulation tool that I think is really important. The following is a list of digital tools to encourage student participation in ways that minimize stress for them. And then the last slide is just more resources for you. So we have a safe and comfortable online classroom checklist. This is located also in your Brain Balance resources for participants handout that you got if you looked at the QR code at the beginning. The different elements here have check marks to the left of them. There's the element listed. There's a column for considerations. There's more resources listed and linked, and then there's examples. So we have a virtual classroom landing page. So when you're thinking about where you're going to be putting your classroom, I know that some teachers use Google Classroom, but because Nevada adopted Canvas, I used Canvas here as examples. So we have considerations are students' ages and abilities, their comfort with technology. If you go to Canvas Commons, you can choose a template that's already created that fits kids of the age that you are teaching. So I'm going to take one moment and show you that video. Let me get there. All right, when I share these videos, I'm going to mute my sound so that you can hear the video better. Here's the video showing you how you can go into Canvas Common to find a template that is appropriate for your student's age. I think I look for some middle school template perhaps, but regardless of what I look for here, this is how you would do it for whatever age your students are.
When you're building an online classroom or you're operating within an online classroom that you maybe want to update to make a little more friendly for your students, you want to consider how they're going to be navigating it, their comfort level, the student's age, and their abilities. So if you're using Canvas, because the Nevada Department of Education has purchased that for the districts across the state, I'm using that as an example. If you're using Canvas, you can go to Canvas Commons. So if you take a look at my screen, you're going to go ahead and you're going to see along the side here the letter C with an arrow pointing to the right. You're going to click on that. That'll bring you to the Commons. When you're here in the Commons, you're going to click Filter. And then what I do is I look for Pages. I click on Templates. And then if you notice here, you've got all the grade levels. So let's say I teach middle school. I want to look at 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I can then come back here and I could filter through these. So this is an example where it says days of the week tabs. I want to take a look what that looks like. So this is the weekly agenda. So if I downloaded something like this and I use this as a template within my class, it could be easy for middle school students to navigate because it breaks it down by day, gives them an objective and an agenda, keeps them organized, routine, so they know what's coming up, right? So if they're logging in on a Tuesday, they know when not only what is happening on Tuesday, but they know what's happening the rest of the week too. Routine, as discussed earlier in the presentation, routine is incredibly important for students who have experienced trauma, making sure that they understand expectations of the environment and they can have some element of the day is predictable for them, keeps them from going into that panic mode and then their brains like exiting learning brain and going more toward, panic, highly emotional brain. So you want something that, again, is going to be at their level, is going to be easy to navigate, consider your students' abilities, and that is going to give them is going to be something that you can use so that it gives them some element of routine. And the more you can put up front like this, the better it is for the students.
All right, so that was the video example under that first element there. We have virtual norms and practices regarding engagement, muting, videos, etc. I linked a blog that is a good resource if you just want to think about the things that you should consider when you're making your list of virtual norms. Considerations should be around equity, student comfort, your academic and your social emotional learning goals. Those are all things that should go into consideration when you're making that list. The next element is a relationship building plan. So this sounds kind of silly, but having something written down so that you know that you're putting in effort and where you're putting in that effort. So things like, how are you going to spend one-on-one time with your students that may need that? Include student interest in some of the work that you're doing with the kids. How are you allowing students time to interact with one another? That sort of thing. You can also put in, well, we'll talk about that later in the list. You want things for family engagement too, right? Building those relationships. That's the very bottom. Plan for family engagement. So you can maybe do a virtual family night, show parents how to navigate your site. That is a really easy, friendly thing that you can do for your parents. Is if you expect your students to use a certain virtual tool or platform like Canvas, create a video that you can email to your parents and your students, your families and their students, and let them know, look, this is how you navigate it, right? Don't just assume that it's intuitive, because it's not. So having those plans for building relationships with your kiddos, letting them build plans with each other, and then building plans with their family is really important. Low stress student engagement strategies. Have a list, have like, a toolkit ready. That's what this is supposed to help you with too. Consider your students' comfort and their ability with language, whether it's speaking, writing, etc. Like, are they able to type? Those types of things. Your resources there: Pear Deck, Mentimeter, Vocaroo, Canvas Studio. So Pear Deck is similar to some other, I think it's Nearpod is one of the ones that teachers use a lot. It allows for interactive slides. As a teacher, you can use Pear Deck and see how your students are responding to things, but you can also share it with the whole class in an anonymous way. So the other kids can see other student work, but they don't know which work belongs to which kid. So that's really helpful. We'll talk about more of these later as we get to that part of the toolkit. But everything is linked in this particular checklist. Vocaroo is one that you can teach your students to use very easily. If they have a microphone, they can record their own voice to do a response for you. And then it gives them a URL that they could just copy and paste and throw into whatever document you want them to throw it into, or an email, however you want them to submit it to you. But those are some options. So then, resources for students to use for self-regulation. We're going to talk about one a little bit more in depth, and we talked about it during the last webinar if you watched that. There's something called Close Gap, and Close Gap is a wonderful tool that allows students to really reflect on how they're feeling, what physical symptoms are associated with that, what may have led to that particular feeling, and then it gives them some options for coping strategies around that feeling that they're having. It's also age appropriate for pre-K through 12th grade, and if you're going to be using it, you're going to be using it on your landing page, most likely. Make the link easy to find. So trauma education resources for students of all ages. We already talked about the Neuron model, so you can use your arm to talk to your kids in an age appropriate way about the structure of the brain and the different cells that make the brain up. For primary, you can have circle time, have an open conversation following, and then I have these steps. I'm going to show you this. There's 9 tips for talking to kids about trauma, and it talks about initiating the conversation, reassuring them, and it gives you some really great tips on how to start that conversation. You don't necessarily need to talk to young kids about the structure of their brain, because they're probably not going to retain that. They are certainly not going to retain all the details that have to do with, the one part of the brain communicating with another, and under certain circumstances it's not going to communicate what you want it to. That's very complicated for pre-K, kindergarten, first grade. But if you talk to them about trauma in general with that during circle time, you talk about feelings during circle time. That's really helpful. And in fact, in the blue page resource that you got from the QR code, I think it's the very last item in that table, is a primary grade friendly feelings check-in, where kids have, and it's a paper pencil, but you can easily make it digital through Google Forms or Jamboard or whatever other tools that your kids are comfortable using. You can easily create it virtually, but essentially you're giving them some four big emotions, right? There's happy, there's sad, there's angry, and there's fearful, but then you're leaving them a space to draw their own face in case they're having some other sort of feeling. So that's in there for you too. And at the elementary level, we have a video called What is Trauma that was created by another school in another state. They got a grant to be able to create that video. There's a song. Watch it first, make sure you feel like it's appropriate for your students, but it does talk about the impact of trauma on learning. At the secondary level, there's an understanding trauma video, which is really good for your teacher colleagues to see, but it also for older students 6 through 12. It might be appropriate for them too to see, you know, the impact that the trauma has on the brain. And really it kind of it explains it through talking about a learning brain and a survival brain. And so it gives that dichotomy that's really easy for older kids to understand. Once they understand in general and in an age appropriate way what trauma is and that it does negatively impact the brain, they need to have an adult walk them through some self-regulation strategies. All students, even the ones that are really well behaved right now, all students can benefit from self-regulation strategies. They're not going to be children forever. They're going to be out in the real world way sooner than we anticipate. And they're going to need to know what to do in the event of extreme anxiety or extreme stress. So if we help give them those strategies now, we develop them in them while they're with us, then it becomes second nature to them. And that's much more helpful for them and their mental health in the future. So going back to Close Gap, I'm going to show you guys a couple of things, but Close Gap is currently free for educators. You can sign up your school, you can sign up your classroom, and each kid can get an account. I'm going to show you these two videos, but when you click on the Close Gap here, it should take you to the website where you can create your own free account. They now are offering premium accounts, but they have resources in those premium accounts that you may not need. It is perfectly functional with the free account. Some of the things that I really like about it is that when you're signing up your students at the grade level that they are, it will adjust accordingly. So, you know, the experience that a 7th grade student has with it is much different than an experience that a kindergartner has with it. The Close Gap for pre-K through 5 students, you might want to show them this video before you have them start using the tool so they can understand what it is. And then for educators, this is a video that I like you guys to see. I'm not going to play the whole thing right now because it was in my last
Grammarly does more.
Because it was in my last webinar and you could see it there. But what this video does is this gentleman is a teacher and he has his students using Close Gap regularly. So he walks you through what it looks like from a student's perspective, but then he also walks you through what your dashboard looks like at the teacher's end. So you could see what the kids are entering, what they're learning. Really helpful video. It's also linked right here, the Close Gap for educators. This entire slide deck is linked in that handout that I gave you. So Headspace is a meditative tool, but there are other meditative tools out there. Lots of information about how meditation has a positive impact on brains that have been negatively impacted by trauma. So think about meditation, guided meditation. One of the things I want to point out, and I was talking to a colleague about this not long ago, not everybody is open to that. I will say myself, when I was in high school, I remember we had some teachers that were trying to do some of that guided meditation. I fell right asleep. I was not I was not able to do that. But it does help. It does help some students. So figure out what it is your kids need and what works, and maybe a meditative tool like Headspace would be great for you. Games to practice self-control help. Jenga, for example, and this link here takes you to a digital version of Jenga, which is very fun to play. You can also have students do some shared journaling. So instead of students shouting out of turn, which sometimes happens when they have very little impulse control, you could create a Padlet or a Jamboard to have them do shared journaling. So during shared journaling, basically what they're doing is they're jotting down notes that they want to shout out to you or to other students in the class. So it takes some time to get them used to this, but if you get them creating, a digital share journal, they can over time keep track of what it was they wanted to say. And if there are important questions, they will be able to go back to those quite easily. Allowing kids to take movement breaks, super important. At the same time, it's very important that you take movement breaks as well. So get that blood flowing, make sure that you're, moving around. You want things to be as healthy as possible. Mindful breathing. So if you click on this here, it'll take you to these free you'll have to log in to download it at Teachers Pay Teachers, but it's free. It's mindfulness breath boards or breathing boards. So basically it'll show arrows, like, and then you follow the arrows and it'll say breathe in here, breathe out there. They're very easy to create and to share digitally. You can put them on the screen and do these exercises with them as a class. It's a great free tool to use. Discussion scenarios can also be used in Padlet or Jamboard. So you can start having conversations with them about different scenarios so that when scenarios come up, their stress levels are down because they're prepared to respond to them. So for example, you can write little cards or little Jamboard what's called post-it notes and have them respond. But you could say something like, you're really, really hungry, but there's a long line at lunch for pizza. So what should you do? And allowing them to think about scenarios that may cause stress or frustration and decide with their learning/thinking brain, not their emotional survival brain, what a good response is. It kind of prepares them and front loads them for that response in the event that it happens. And so if you have regular scenarios where they can discuss how they would respond and really think about if that's the best course of action, will help prepare them for those situations. So one of the other things I wanted to mention with Close Gap before I forget is, so basically the way Close Gap works is kids will select their emotion. Then there will be follow-up questions based upon what emotion they chose. And then there will be even more questions asking them other contextual things like, did you get enough sleep last night? Did you eat breakfast this morning? Did you get into an argument with anybody before bed or first thing this morning before you came to school? So it asks them questions that start guiding us towards an image of what's happening with the kid. And long term, those kids have a dashboard where they can see themselves. You know what? Every time I go to bed late or I don't eat breakfast, I'm kind of in a crabby mood. Like that really helps them with recognition and reflection of what it is they're experiencing and how that impacts their behavior. One of the other benefits of Close Gap is that at the end of all of that, it will ask them, what do they feel like their energy level is for the day? And then the very next step is that it takes them into a choice option where they can select what kind of self-regulation activity they're going to use. So they may have journaling, it may be breathing, what have you, but they get to choose what it is they want to do. When you're looking at it as your educator on your educator dashboard, you'll see all of the responses that the students put in, as well as what activity they chose. So if you're seeing that the kids are choosing the same activity over and over after, their initial experience with Close Gap, then you know which ones work best with them, and you can utilize those in other situations, even outside of the app. So digital tools to encourage student participation in ways that minimize stress. These are ones that I have spoken about already in my last webinar. So I don't want to spend too much time because I linked to that. So you can always spend some time looking at it. But there's Jamboard, Mentimeter, Padlet, Closed Gap, Pear Deck, Kahoot. These different digital tools allow your students to participate and for you to monitor that participation, but it can do it in a way that maybe doesn't require them to speak out loud if that's something that causes them anxiety, or type in the chat if that's something that causes them anxiety. With Jamboard, it can be anonymous unless you have them write their name on it. With Mentimeter, it usually is anonymous. With Padlet, it can be anonymous. It depends on how you set that up. With Closed Gap, it is completely between you and the students, not and the individual students. They don't know what the other students are saying. Pear Deck, you have options where you can show all of the student work without the names, or you could show it with the names. If you're showing it without the names, then those kids know that they can participate, they can be confident in their participation, they could still see the work when you show it to the students, but they don't have to feel the anxiety about what their classmates are going to think, right? And Kahoot is something that you can play online, or they now have an offline component available. The one caveat to Kahoot that I wanna discuss is that the way people use it a lot of times is a timed kind of like quiz. So essentially, you're having like a game where the students are responding to questions, but the way Kahoot assigns points, it's the one who logs in first. So if you know that you have students who are going to need some extra processing time, Kahoot would probably not be the best option for you in all circumstances. So more resources for you. We have Seed, and we have Castle. So let's take a look at Seed here. This page right here will take you to the catalog. And if you type in Seed, you can then request joining it. So you just click on it and follow the steps. One of the things I wanted to show you, let me find the form. Once you've requested access to it, you'll find it on your dashboard, and it's right here, the Social, Emotional, and Academic Development Center. It'll take you to this landing page, and the landing page will explain what everything is. So here's the first part I will show you.
Hello, and welcome to the Seed Center. My name is Dr. Joanne Cason, and I'm here to introduce you to the virtual support that's available to you. The Seed Center, Social, Emotional, Academic Development Center, is an online community of support around the area of social emotional learning. You can get immediate help, lessons, articles, videos, and interact with people around the area of social emotional learning. Looking forward to seeing you online, and thank you so much for joining us online.
So that's their official welcome message. And then if you scroll down, it'll say, what is the Seed Center? It's a 2-minute video that'll show you what that is and what they've pulled together for you.
Welcome to the Nevada Department of Education Seed Center's session today. On the screen, you see the contact information for the Seed Center project leads, Marie Dufresne, Sylvana Gordon, and Tara Madden-Dent. Feel free to reach out to any of us. School leaders and educators statewide count on NDE to lead through challenges and unknowns. We collectively stand at the ready. Next slide. Together, we stand to do our best for the benefit of educators and students, and the Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, or SEED Center, is one opportunity to lead by offering examples of evidence-based guidance and support practices statewide. We know the quality of an educator is the single greatest in-school determinant of student outcomes. Therefore, The Nevada Department of Education's online Seed Center was created to provide a safe, supportive space designed to promote adult social emotional learning and skill building.
In its initial phase, the Seed Center provided over 150 educators with access to a support resource for both personal growth and depth of professional knowledge rooted in the most current and practical social emotional research-based resources. Educators statewide are benefiting from individual and group coaching, virtual wellness sessions, training and workshops, state and national guest speakers, expert implementation coaches, a resource library, live office hours, and PD modules that are designed to deepen understanding and knowledge about social emotional practices for educators who seek to create conditions for adult and youth success. The Seed Center is actively and intentionally building a cadre of certificated SEL champions who will then serve collectively as a statewide resource to support respective district regions in providing maximum benefit to educators and ultimately to students. Thank you for joining us today.
All right. So the Seed Center, as you heard, has a lot of resources for you to continue your learning about social emotional learning and how to approach that in your classroom, the best practices associated with that. And then Castle is another one. If you click on this, it'll take you to their website. They have a very, very extensive website that has a lot of resources there pertaining, all of it is pertaining to social emotional learning. So that is our presentation for today. Again, my name is Amanda Arcio. You can reach me at aarceo.nvdlc@gmail.com. You can also find a podcast on Spotify called Build STEAM Nevada. I'm also hosting that podcast where I'm interviewing STEM and STEAM educators and program leaders from across the state of Nevada to give teachers, students, parents, families an awareness of what wonderful things are going on in the state pertaining to STEM and STEAM. And if you have any questions, my phone number's up there. Feel free to call or text me. If I don't answer right away, just leave a message. Let me know who you are and how I can help you. I am always happy to help. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks.